Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfic. This will be the continuation of Those Who Were Asked. This will be part 2. Their two tails switched back and forth while their ears flicked around, trying to detect any sounds of crime. Even with decent night vision, Bach and Neko still preferred to rely on their sense of hearing to navigate Chiba when the sun set. Shadows had a way of warping, creating enemies that weren't there, or hiding those who had grown used to the shade, especially in dimly lit alleyways. It was for that reason that they had been able to pinpoint the sound of someone following them, a difficult feat considering they were known for traveling via the skyline, before disappearing without a trace. In the end, they had almost ended up throwing a child off a roof. Bakaneko was glad that they had been able to stop at the last moment. The kid shouted surprise enough to make them hesitate. But seriously, parkour at night, in pursuit of a hero? It was suspicious in the best of lights, and the neon signs were dim around these areas. Noticing a group huddled together near a back door, they jumped down a story, straining their ears to catch the tail end of the group's conversation as they thought back to the conversation they'd ended up having with the kid. They'd said no to the kid's question since the answer was obvious to them, but it had ended up being more a snapped response than they'd planned. It had been awkward. Both left standing on a rooftop, arm's length apart from where they'd put him down. The kid still puffed from following them over rooftops and Bakaneko not knowing what to say next. This is why they had a good PR team, so they didn't have to deal with the awkward silences that seemed to grow around them. The kid hadn't exactly been smooth either, just stuttering out a thank you and turning around to disappear over the rooftops they had both crossed only a few minutes prior. They were brought back to the present situation with the movement of the small group, two members handing off a small box to the other three, looking suspicious enough about it that Bakaneka decided to follow the three as they departed. They technically did have a patrol route, but their position as the number 26 hero gave them a lot of leniency. Even with 3 pairs of eyes keeping a lookout, they didn't spot Bakaneko as they tailed them, their quirk helping them go unnoticed. It was a useful feature that set them apart from other similar cat-morph quirk heroes. In fact, they knew plenty of heroes with non-physical quirks or purely aesthetic mutative quirks. Sure, having a quirk would be a leg up compared to having none, but no quirk was perfect for every situation. Had they been wrong? Was there a reason someone without a quirk couldn't be a hero besides not having a quirk? Why was that the deal-breaker? He grumbled under his breath the whole way back to his agency, for once not just about the earful he'd been getting about collateral damage, as if that actually mattered. No, some kid had managed to figure out where his rampage path would lead, and had intercepted him at the end. Marauder had taken one look at the small, gangly, awkward kid and decided he was a write-off. And then he'd revealed he was fucking quirkless, a negative space in society. What the fuck, he wanted to be a hero with a condition like that? Absolutely disgusting. Spitting at his feet and moving on was a kind response for what scum like that actually deserved. His head hurt. A lot. Damn, if that hit didn't hurt like a bitch, he might have got a concussion from that. God, there was nothing worse than a long-range villain, what with his close-range matter manipulation quirk, and the coward had fucking run for it after all that trouble, disappearing off the scene after managing to get one good hit in. After all, what else would cause a villain to leave mid-attack? There were no other heroes nearby, only a few police who were busy keeping civilians safe. He would find out later, once his head was clear and the villains in custody, that the third villain had been found knocked out cold with no evidence as to who or what did it. He tried blinking to clear his sight, but there was something in his eyes, making everything hazy. He was pretty sure there was someone in front of him, saying something, and they weren't clearing up when he rubbed his eyes and their words were taking too long to process. Shit, definitely a concussion. But the scene wasn't locked down yet, with the 2 villains only just going into custody and the third God knows where, so he couldn't clock out yet. What was that? He squinted at the figure. Damn, it was small. A kid? Before the question finally made its way to his brain. Yeah, nah, I don't think that'd work out. God, his head hurt. He needed a paramedic, or at least a lie down after taking some painkillers. This is what he got for being a hero, and a pretty good one at that. Anyone without a quirk would have been eaten alive. There's no way they could take out villains. He'd finally managed to pull the last of the victims out of the rubble, along with the help of a few other on-scene heroes to assist in shifting heavier pieces. After fights with such significant fallout, his clones were better put to use finding victims and freeing them if they could. But it did mean they tended to be weaker as their numbers increased. Due to the roads being blocked by sections of fallen building materials, he'd had to leave a few clones around to assist with medical aid as well as searching, at least until more paramedics could make it to the scene. Ectoplasm brushed some of the dust off himself, knowing it wouldn't make much difference, before making his way back to where the heroes had begun gathering, now that the main problems had been dealt with. Soon, construction and demolition workers would arrive to salvage what they could and remove what was left of the fallen building, and the victims would either be taken to hospital or cleared to go about their lives. One victim had stood out to him this time. He couldn't see him amongst those still gathered, but the boy who'd asked if a quirkless person, presumably himself, could be a hero had certainly gotten Ectoplasm's attention. He'd been quite unusual. From what Ectoplasm could tell, he'd been helping with other victims, but wasn't with any form of recovery group, and he doubted that the boy had a medical training history based on his age. When he'd asked if someone without a quirk could be a hero, Ectoplasm had shut him down. He was used to answering his students' questions dealing with absolute values in math classes and life or death as a hero. This question had been no different. He pressured his students to do their best by not holding back. He lost his legs to the heroics lifestyle and knew others who had lost more. Immediately saying no to a kid's hopeless dream may seem cruel to most, but it was better to put a stop to it now than wait for him to be hurt. Izuku had already been hurt. Another rejection was just an addition to that particular hurt. He hoped at the very least he hadn't been lying when he said he didn't need medical attention. The boy had been helping other victims with a distant look on his face, and when he'd asked his question, it was like second nature, rather than something of importance. Maybe it was for a friend, and the boy did have a quirk. Either way, he'd stand by his answer. Without a quirk, it'd be impossible to be a hero. Lights Up was freaking out just a little bit, or a lot maybe. He just watched someone fall, a full story, which is totally survivable, but if you land wrong, that hurts. He ran over, quirk flaring to let him see the scene better. The kid was curled in a fetal position, clutching at his sides. Lights Up couldn't see any red mixing with his green hair or pulling on the ground around him, so things were looking good. "Hey, kid, you all right?" The kid looked up at him, squinting his green eyes against the light he was putting off. "Hi." It was breathless, and followed by a wince, but if he was following his words all right and looking around fine, then no concussion probably. Lights Up had never been the best at first aid. It wasn't like it was his job or anything. Can someone without a quirk become a hero? The question stopped Lights Up in his tracks. Quirkless. He sneered down at the kid, dimming his quirk so he wouldn't be wasting energy on this. "You should go get your head checked for worms. Quirkless people barely even exist anymore. There's no way one could be a hero." And with that, he turned on his heel and left. That level of stupidity could fend for itself or get killed off, preferably the second option. Cementos was having a long week. Students had been slacking off in history across the board, and there was only so much he could do to make the lessons more interesting. The students wanted to be in UA, and their grades were fine. They had to be. UA only accepted the top applicants. But there was no interest. If not for the competitive nature of the school, he was sure there would have been severe drops in quality. And just moments ago, he'd had to tell a child that looked close to passing out from exhaustion that he couldn't be a hero. Regrettable, but if he'd been exhausted from a short run, there was no way he would be able to keep up with the trials of hero work. He was lucky to have such a good, versatile quirk. He was well aware of the bias for powerful quirks in the industry. After all, he watched hundreds of applicants who could have been great heroes fail to get into UA each year because their quirks weren't suited for the entrance exam. Which was why he'd told the boy no. Without the advantage of a quirk, he wouldn't stand a chance against the competition of the hero course in UA or other heroics-oriented high schools. Sure, there were other paths to professional heroics, but not many heroes accepted apprentices, and fewer would even consider a quirkless one. So it was better to let him down gently now, instead of letting him waste time on entrance exams that would reject him. The weak, fevered-looking kid was looking at him, waiting for an answer, spinning top thought for a second, trying to come up with an answer, but when he opened his mouth, he couldn't help the laugh that came spilling out. He tried to rein it in, think of anything to say, but just ended up laughing more. He couldn't pull it together, so he decided it'd just be better to walk away, laughing the whole time. That should be a pretty clear enough answer anyway. A quirkless hero? As if. He'd overheard Mariko and one of the interns talking about a green quirkless kid, that a few heroes had encountered the same kid asking the same question, but he didn't think it was real. Just some more gossip, another fan that happened to share the same attributes with a dozen other fans. His laughter had subsided, but he still let out a chuckle at the thought of a kid actually becoming a hero. What an idiot. Taking a deep breath, 13 centered themselves, trying to stay focused on the next task ahead of them. It had been a big, pretty terrible day, and it wasn't even past noon yet, and now Now there were rumors spreading throughout the relief workforce that the council and local heroes had been tipped off that the landslide was going to happen. Needless to say, an investigation would be opened if the rumors had even a grain of truth in them, but that would have to wait until after the aftermath had been dealt with. Honestly, what villain would tell people that they're going to cause a natural disaster? It could only be a villain, after all. As a scientist or hero, who else would be able to predict natural disasters? Would have come forward more publicly. But that wasn't their problem to deal with. They lowered their radio, ready to set off in the direction of the next site that needed to be cleared, when a voice spoke up from behind them. Hello? When they looked over their shoulder, it wasn't one of the emergency workers that greeted them. Instead, it was a boy that was dressed like a civilian, but sporting a fairly heavy-duty bag. Strange. They'd noticed him helping the emergency workers, but he didn't look like one of them. "Hello, how can I help you?" they replied. "I have a question, if you don't mind me asking." They quickly looked around them, and down at their radio. They were needed elsewhere, and asking for permission meant this was probably a personal question. They hoped it wasn't for an autograph. They didn't have any paper with them, rather than a question related to the current disaster. There wasn't any time to waste in these situations, but they didn't want to brush the kid off. "Sure, just keep it short if you can. There's still a lot to do here." "Can someone without a quirk become a hero?" Can someone without a quirk be a... Did he mean quirkless? And what kind of hero? Probably a pro-hero in all likelihood, but they weren't sure. All kinds of professions and actions could be considered heroic. Was he referring to himself? They didn't want to give him precise answers, so they decided their best option would be to ask for clarification. "I'm sorry, I don't understand the question." "Oh," he answered, an absent hand smearing more dust on his face instead of wiping it off like it was probably meant to. 13 was lucky their suit's material didn't allow dust, dirt, and mud to cling to it. Otherwise, it had been stained a long time ago. "Do you think a quirkless person could become a certified pro-hero?" So 13 had been right about the question's intent. How to answer, though? They thought of some of the students at UA, of the other heroes they had met on the field. If they wanted to be a pro-hero just for the fame and attention, probably not. For that, you have to be marketable, and a big part of that is having a quirk to market. If they wanted to help people, however... 13 paused, trying to judge the character of the boy in front of them. Then they could help people the way you're doing right now, becoming part of emergency services, training to be a doctor, joining the police force. All these things help people. Could give them the power to save people without being a hero. So I guess no, I don't think someone without a quirk can be a hero, but that doesn't mean you can't be helpful, or that you'll save fewer people. Does that answer your question? The kid nodded, so 13 was satisfied that they hadn't gone off topic this time, or begun rambling. But they only had a moment to feel that satisfaction before they switched their mindset, ready to get back to work. That being said, "Are you all right? You look pretty tired." They were a rescue hero, and looking out for others was a large part of their job. The kid adjusted his backpack and shook his head. "There are still people that need help. I'll be fine. Do you know where would be the best place to go next?" 13 hesitated for a moment. He probably wasn't as young as he looked. They wouldn't let a child join the rescue efforts, right? Because that made the most sense. Volunteers were often gathered to help with disasters, and with how widespread and recent this one had been, it made sense he hadn't been given any identifying gear yet. It wasn't strictly protocol, but they knew that when lives were on the line, protocols could be shifted. And if he was looking to help more people, then he needed to head east, where a concentration of hikers usually appeared, so they directed him that way. "Thanks." He bowed to 13, moving on without looking back. 13 watched him go briefly, before starting their walk further up the mountain. There were more people to be saved, after all. The taller lady leaned heavily against Kisagiriman, her arm wrapped around his shoulders awkwardly. No wonder the kid had given her over to him without much of a fight. He had been so short that taking her weight would have been awkward, even without the uneven terrain. He could pick over it without an issue, but the lady was really struggling. He was worried she might have a head wound. If so, that meant he just had to get her to medics faster. Once that was done, he'd be able to use his speed to scan the mountain for survivors. If what that kid had said was right, most of the people left were individuals or small groups, or buried too far into the rubble to be saved. But that grim reality was not something he needed to voice. All the rescue personnel knew this. "Hey!" The short one spoke up from where she followed closely behind them. "Yes?" "Why'd you tell that kid that quirkless people can't be heroes?" "A good question." Heroics is a job with high competition and incredibly difficult even once you achieve the position of a professional hero. It demands too much for someone without a quirk to keep up with. But he helped us. He looked over then, hearing the tears in her voice, but luckily none were falling yet. He was so level-headed the whole time. He was carrying pretty much all of Satsuki's weight, even though his own legs were scraped up. I even pointed that out, and he said he'd have medics check it over later, but Satsuki was more important than some scrapes. She sniffed. I'm pretty sure he was lying. He just started walking back up the mountain when you showed up. Do you think he'll be okay? She was looking at him with far too much hope, as if he knew the inner workings of a quirkless kid's mind. He thought back to the encounter. Yes, he'd made the right call in taking the taller woman, Satsuki apparently, but maybe he should have insisted the boy come with them. There was nothing he could do about it now, though, so he focused on his current job. I'm sure he'll be all right. He didn't seem like he was ready to give up. And as Kesagiraman said that, he had the distinct impression that that applied to more than just rescuing people from the landslide. Why did he say no, if he thought the kid was going to keep going anyway? He'd have to think about it later, when everyone was safe. Hey, Pixie-Bob. Yeah? They were making their way back up the mountain, or what was left of it, where a base of operations had been set up. The cell tower that had been on the mountain had been taken with the rest of the landslide, and technicians were up there, now doing their best to set up a temporary network so those in danger could reach out and loved ones could get in touch with each other. Radios and personal comms were still fine, but most civilians that were caught up in this disaster wouldn't have those on hand. Do you think we should have said something else to that boy? Ragdoll couldn't help but remember the way he'd said that others still needed help, even though he'd been helping the others at the shrine all day. Pixie-Bob thought about it for a second, hopping over a series of broken trees as if it were nothing, before shaking her head. That kitten means well, I'm sure, but he needs to face reality, even if it is a bit harsh. Ragdoll hummed. It made sense. Mandalay probably would have tried to encourage the kid, even though she knew the best out of all of them that reality could be harsh and cruel. Coda still didn't talk to Ragdoll, but that was okay. He could take all the time he wanted. Pixie-Bob was also usually the type to cheer people on, but she also had a powerful quirk, and power recognized power. Her own quirk was useful, but not exactly physical, so she knew a bit better that quirks weren't the be-all end-all to heroics. Maybe we should have gotten a name. We didn't get a name from anyone else from that shrine group. Pixie-Bob turned back to look at her. Is this really bothering you? She pulled herself over a boulder, skipping along the new path the landslide had created. I guess he was just doing his best to help others, so I feel bad for putting him down. Maybe we should have mentioned something like becoming a doctor. Maybe, Pixie-Bob shrugged. We can't do anything about it now, though. She turned and extended a hand to Ragdoll, helping her get over a granite ledge. Even though she really didn't need the help, they were teammates, and they would always support each other. We're almost back at the base anyway, and I doubt they'll give us more than a second to grab a sip of water before they're telling us where to go next. Ragdoll kept her hold on Pixie-Bob's hand, leaning heavily on her while pouting. I wish Tiger was here. He would carry me for sure. Hey, no complaining. It was impossible to break Ragdoll's grip without hurting her, so Pixie-Bob just rolled her eyes after several useless attempts to stop her latching on. Ragdoll smiled and poked her tongue out at her teammate before racing her the final stretch to the base. Sure, it was a bit childish, but it was moments like these that stopped them from getting too caught up in the repetitive, depressing parts of their job. Oh dear, here's some water. It was admirable that the examinees pushed themselves so hard, but sometimes she wished the exam was a bit less harsh, so there wouldn't be so many injuries, or in this case, symptoms of quirk overuse. She handed the girl the water bottle, while giving her a quick look over for any injuries. Thanks, the girl croaked out, accepting the bottle. The boy beside her was also not in the best shape, a bruise already growing on one side of his face and blood covering the palms of his hands. You look a little worse for wear. He let out a huff of laughter, the tone of which set off Recovery Girl's instincts, because that was the whoops I've injured myself horribly, can you please fix it laugh. She'd worked with enough reckless hotshots throughout the years to recognize it in her sleep, but it did surprise her to hear it from someone so young, and so quietly. I'll be all right, but could I ask you something? She stayed silent, waiting for him to continue. These young hero types were often so brash and outspoken, she hadn't expected there to actually be a gap of silence for her to agree or disagree. Can someone without a quirk become a hero? Oh, another hero hopeful. He must not be sure if he got enough points. She couldn't exactly tell him yes. That would be counterproductive if he took her word for it and then didn't get admitted. But saying no straight after putting so much effort in could also be saddening for him. Even if it was likely, if he'd been completing the exam quirkless. Aizawa had been speaking up against the bias of the exam for years and hadn't been able to pass it himself, instead getting in through the sports festival in his first year. So, knowing that he probably didn't pass but seemed to have tried his best, she settled for something a bit vague. Well, it's very difficult to be a hero, dear. He seemed to accept that, so she moved on to more pressing matters. Let's heal you up, and you can think about heroics. She planted a kiss on his forehead. It should have been enough to close up all the scrapes he had and heal his bruises. And then he collapsed. Now, Recovery Girl was a professional, and didn't fully use her quirk unless she knew how much damage it'd be healing, and if that person's body would have the energy to heal those injuries. She'd thought this level would be fine, since it was just meant to deal with bruises and scrapes. What happened? Is he all right? The girl's voice was hoarse and filled with concern. Recovery Girl raised a placating hand to the girl. He'll be all right. He was just too tired, so my quirk made him pass out. She gestured some of the assistants' robots over, and they loaded the kid onto a stretcher before heading towards the infirmary. She would be able to keep an eye on him until he woke up, once she was finished treating all the other examinees. If he'd worked himself to exhaustion and taken more than surface injuries, then maybe his chances of getting in were higher. So many examinees gave up when they realized they weren't suited for the exam's trials. But if he fought hard, then maybe he could have gotten enough points. She doubted it, though. He knew there would probably be an emotional response when he replied to the kid, but he wasn't expecting this. He ran his hand up and down his student's back as he continued to sob, trying to calm him down. Occasionally he added in a reminder to breathe, but he wasn't sure if that was getting through. They'd been like this for the past 5 minutes. Eraserhead wasn't sure how much time had actually passed, but it felt like forever. What the hell had Midoriya done? Been through to completely break down at someone telling him that if you keep working hard, then of course you can be a hero. After a few more minutes, the kid's sobs finally started to calm down, becoming interspersed with random muttered words and phrases which eventually grew to a steady ramble, only interrupted by a few hiccups and sniffles. The tears hadn't stopped yet, though. Oh, God. Eraserhead watched as Midoriya's face morphed into a look of panic. Oh, God, I'm such a fucking idiot. Everyone was right. Sure, I can become a hero, but I'm so behind. I don't even have any training. What do I even do next? I don't know how to do anything. Whatever he said next was lost to Eraserhead as his frantic rambles grew quieter and faster, but it probably wouldn't have processed for him even if they had stayed clear. He stared at the kid, who got the second highest score on the UA entrance exam, as he panicked about not having any skills or training. Eraserhead had thought that maybe he didn't realize he was already on the path to becoming a hero, but now... Midoriya. He waited for a sign that the kid had heard him, repeating his name until he looked up from the curled position he'd pulled himself into. You realize you're in UA's hero course, right? It was almost worth seeing the kid in his sobbing state for the expression he made at that. His green eyes went huge as his mouth opened and closed a few times before he managed to let out a choked, What? You came second on the entrance exam. Still seeing the incredulous expression on his student's face, he continued. The heroics course entrance exam. How did you not realize? He watched as what he said sank in. What? The disbelief was still there, but now it was joined by understanding. You're right. You're right, and I didn't. This was the only way I could figure out to ask you. Eraserhead's brows furrowed. What do you mean? Midoriya looked like a deer in headlights at his question, frozen aside from the occasional sniffle. Eraserhead waited, knowing that he was probably still scrambling to get his thoughts in order. His patience paid off when the kid let out a shaky breath and began explaining. I needed to ask you if you thought someone without a quirk could be a hero, but you're impossible to track down even though you mostly work within Musutafu. No set patrol routes, no agency, underground, so a lot of your details are kept hidden. No online presence, barely any presence at all, really. Even dedicated underground heroics forums only had the bare basics on you. He rubbed at his face, trying to brush away some of the tears that still gathered in his eyes. I tried finding you by just wandering around at night, since that's when you patrol, but that's all chance-based, and my luck isn't very good. There wasn't even enough information on you to find a pattern on where you appeared, but I finally managed to find out you teach at UA, and it's not like I can break in, so the best option was to become a student. That was Not what Eraserhead was expecting. Midoriya had been specifically looking for him and figured the best way to do that was by getting into UA, a feat in itself. How long have you been planning this? Well, I guess I did get lucky for that one. Entrance exams were over a week away when I found out you taught here. It was said so casually, as if it was lucky that he'd only had a week to prep for the most prestigious school in the country. That was something Eraserhead would have to unpack later. The level of effort he'd put into tracking down one hero begged a different question. How many heroes have you tracked down for this? The kid sniffled once before his tears were back in full force. It wasn't the gut-wrenching sobs of before, but he was still nonverbal again. That at least gave Eraserhead an indication that it'd been more than a couple of heroes. None of them said you could be a hero. Midoriya shook his head. You're the only person who's ever said I can be a hero. The statement was quiet, broken by slight hitches in his voice. His reaction made a bit more sense now. If he'd asked several heroes, though a nagging thought told him it was more than just several, and they'd all denied him, of course he'd be emotional when someone believed in him. He sighed. Heroics is a pretty tough industry. You have to understand that's why they would have said no. Midoriya shook his head again, more ferociously this time. In contrast, his voice was near inaudible now. You don't understand. You're the only person who has ever said I could be a hero. No wonder he'd looked so tired and resigned when he'd asked his question. Eraserhead knew this would be a headache and a half to deal with, but he was determined to find out just what had happened to this kid. If he could get this far without aiming for heroics, he almost feared what he could do when he actually put his mind to it. Midoriya would become a hero, regardless of those he had asked. All right, listeners, this concludes the fic, Those Who Were Asked, which is the second part of the Frequently Asked Questions series by this author. I do plan to podfic the third fic in this author series as well. I'm eager to hear your all's thoughts and reactions to this fic. I really think the author does a nice job of showing you the other side of it from the hero's perspective. I really like that they did this as well. I think it just creates a nice complementary fic to go along with the first one. Fic 3 in this series will be next, and as always, thank you all so much for listening.